In 2019, a man named E. Dean Butler flew out to visit a cluster of eyeglass factories in China. Butler wasn't some outside journalist poking around out of curiosity. He'd actually founded Lens Crafters back in 1983 and built it into the largest optical chain in North America before losing control of the company he started. He went to see firsthand what the industry he'd helped build had actually turned into. What he found, and later told the Los Angeles Times, was that a quality eyeglass frame costs somewhere between $4 and $8 to produce. A designer frame, the kind carrying a Prada or Chanel label, runs about $15. A first quality lens costs roughly $1.25. Those same frames and lenses, manufactured for pennies on the dollar, were selling in the United States for around $800. It's ridiculous, Butler said. It's a complete ripoff. The reason that gap exists isn't a mystery, and it isn't really a secret either. It's just not something most people ever have a reason to look into. A single company, EssilorLuxottica, controls an enormous share of the entire eyewear industry. Not just one part of it, but nearly every part of it at once. The company was formed in 2018 when Italy's Luxottica, the world's largest eyewear manufacturer, merged with France's Essilor, the world's largest lens maker. And what came out of that merger wasn't just a big company. It was a business that owns the brands, owns the factories, owns the stores, and owns a big chunk of the insurance that pays for the glasses in the first place. EssilorLuxottica owns Ray-Ban and Oakley outright, manufactures frames under license for Chanel, Prada, Armani, Burberry, and a long list of other names people assume are competing with each other, and also owns Lens Crafters, Sunglass Hut, Pearl Vision, Target Optical, and the online retailer Glasses.com. On top of all of that, it owns iMed Vision Care, one of the largest vision insurance providers in the country, meaning the same company that makes the product, sells the product, and for a huge number of Americans also decides how much insurance will cover toward buying it. Estimates on exact market share vary depending on how narrowly you slice the industry, but analysts have pegged the company's control of the U.S. eyewear market at somewhere around 60%, and reporting citing Vox has put its typical markup on frames and lenses as high as 1,000%. What makes that structure unusual isn't just its size, it's how few checks exist inside it. In most retail industries, a manufacturer, a brand, a store, and an insurer are separate businesses with separate incentives, each one negotiating against the others, which tends to put some natural downward pressure on price somewhere along the chain. When one company owns all four links at once, that internal tension disappears. There's no manufacturer pushing back against a retailer's margin because they're the same company. There's no insurer questioning whether a markup is reasonable because the insurer profits from the same sale. Tim Wu, a law professor at Columbia who studies exactly this kind of market structure, has described the resulting profits in this industry as relatively obscene, pointing out that products in most other categories, laptops, phones, televisions, tend to get better and cheaper over time through competition, while eyeglasses have mostly just stayed expensive. There's a story from the company's history that shows exactly how much leverage that kind of vertical control actually hands a business. Back when Luxottica owned Sunglass Hut, one of the biggest sunglasses retailers in the country, it told its suppliers, including Oakley, to lower their prices. Oakley refused. Not long after, Sunglass Hut simply stopped stocking Oakley products, and around the same time, Luxottica started producing Ray-Ban sunglasses that looked strikingly similar to Oakley's own signature designs. Oakley's stock price dropped, a legal fight followed, and by the end of it, Luxottica bought Oakley outright for somewhere around $2 billion. It's a genuinely remarkable case study in what happens when one company controls both the shelf space and a major competitor's access to it, and it's part of why the word monopoly comes up so often in coverage of this industry, even though EssilorLuxottica itself has consistently pushed back on that characterization, pointing to real competitors like Warby Parker, Zeiss, and Specsavers as evidence the market remains genuinely contested. There's a detail in Butler's story that matters more than it might seem, which is where those cheap frames were actually coming from. Most of the eyeglass frames sold in America, whether they end up under a luxury label Optical or a no-name one, are manufactured in China, and increasingly in one very specific place. A county-level city in Jiangsu province called Danyang produces somewhere between 400 and 800 million pairs of eyeglass lenses every single year, which works out to roughly half the entire world's supply. There's a saying that gets repeated often enough in the industry that it's practically a slogan at this point, that of every 2 people in the world wearing prescription glasses, one of them is looking through a lens made in Danyang. That didn't happen overnight, and the story behind it is a genuinely unlikely one. Danyang had no optical tradition to speak of before the 1960s. The industry actually traces back to a group of educated young people sent from cities like Shanghai and Suzhou into the countryside during that era who had trained at state-run optical factories and brought that know-how with them when they arrived. What started as small-scale lens-grinding workshops, sometimes described as little more than shanty operations, grew steadily through the 1970s and 80s, and by 1987, Danyang was already home to more than 400 optical factories producing 6.5 million pairs of glasses a year. After China's broader economic opening in the early 1990s, foreign capital and technology started flowing in, and the local industry kept climbing the value chain from there, moving from basic glass lenses to resin lenses, and eventually developing its own domestic manufacturing technology rather than relying entirely on imported equipment. A local firm called Zenni Optical developed its own resin lens formulations around 2007, cutting material costs to roughly a third of the imported price, and another Danyang company built China's first domestic lens coating machine in 2014. Today, the city hosts more than 1,600 eyewear-related companies and close to 50,000 workers, all concentrated within a roughly 30-kilometer radius, an industrial cluster dense enough that a buyer can walk from a design sketch to a finished product without ever leaving town. That manufacturing base isn't just cheap either. It's still actively climbing the technology ladder. As recently as 2026, factories in Danyang started installing semiconductor-style lithography machines to produce lenses, a technique borrowed from chip manufacturing that etches millions of microscopic pillars into a flat substrate instead of grinding a curved surface out of a thick blank. Traditional high-prescription lenses can end up 5 to 6 millimeters thick at the center, with as much as 70% of the raw material ground away and wasted in the process. The new nanostructure approach can cut that same high prescription lens down to roughly 2 millimeters using a fraction of the material. It's a genuinely significant manufacturing upgrade, and it's happening in the same county-level city that already makes half the world's lenses, which suggests the cost advantage coming out of Danyang isn't a temporary artifact of cheap labor that other countries could simply replicate. It's compounding. For decades, that manufacturing base mostly stayed invisible to the people actually wearing the glasses it produced, because the frames and lenses coming out of Danyang were simply absorbed into the same supply chain everyone else used, including EssilorLuxottica itself, and then marked up dramatically before reaching a store shelf. What's changed more recently is that a handful of companies figured out they could cut straight to that same manufacturing base and sell directly to the consumer, skipping the branded middlemen, the retail chains, and the insurance layer entirely. Zenni Optical is probably the clearest example. Founded in 2003 by Tibor Lazay and Julia Jen, working out of a garage in San Francisco with nothing but their own savings, Zenni built its entire business model around going straight to the source and now operates a manufacturing facility in Danyang itself spanning nearly 1 million square feet. Because there's no chain of retail stores to maintain, no insurance division layered on top, and no licensing fee paid to a fashion house for the right to stamp a logo on the temple of the frame. Zenni's glasses start at around $7 and the company has sold more than 50 million pairs, growing into one of the highest traffic eyewear retailers online today, competing directly for search visibility against names like Warby Parker and EyeBuyDirect, itself another direct-to-consumer brand manufacturing in China. AliExpress listings selling directly out of Chinese factories push the price even lower. with basic prescription frames occasionally dropping to $5 or less during promotional periods, close enough to the $3 price point that gets attention in headlines, even if that specific figure tends to reflect a limited time deal rather than an everyday baseline price. What's actually happening here isn't that China suddenly invented a new way to make glasses cheaply. China has been making the overwhelming majority of the world's glasses cheaply for years, arguably decades. What's changed is who gets to keep the markup between that cheap manufacturing cost and the final price a customer pays. For most of the industry's recent history, that markup flowed almost entirely to companies like EssilorLuxottica, because there was no easy way for an ordinary consumer to buy directly from a factory in Jiangsu province. E-commerce, direct-to-consumer shipping, and companies willing to build their entire business model around cutting out every possible middleman changed that math. The $4 to $8 frame Butler found in 2019 didn't need to become an $800 pair of glasses anymore. It could just stay close to what it actually cost to make, plus a reasonable margin, and still turn a profit at a fraction of the traditional retail price. None of this means EssilorLuxottica is disappearing anytime soon, and it's worth being honest about the scale gap that still exists. The company generated roughly 28 billion euros in revenue in 2025 and operates more than 17,000 stores worldwide, a footprint no direct-to-consumer challenger comes remotely close to matching. Warby Parker, probably the best-known American upstart in this space, still operates on a scale that's a rounding error next to EssilorLuxottica's retail network. And EssilorLuxottica isn't standing still either. It's pushing hard into smart glasses through its partnership with Meta, selling millions of units of Ray-Ban Meta AI glasses since the line launched, and reportedly drawing investment from Meta itself as part of that expanding relationship. A bet that the next era of eyewear might be worth more as a piece of wearable technology than as a simple vision correction product. But the pressure is real, and it's coming from a direction the traditional eyewear industry never really had to defend against before. For most of the last century, if you needed glasses, your options were essentially limited to whatever an optometrist's office or a mall retail chain had on the wall. And virtually every one of those walls, whether it said LensCrafters or Sunglass Hut or a boutique optician's name above the door, traced back to the same small handful of manufacturers and increasingly back to EssilorLuxottica specifically. Direct-to-consumer manufacturing breaks that dependency completely. A customer today can order a pair of prescription glasses shipped straight from the same factory cluster that's been quietly producing half the world's lenses for years, at a price that would have sounded like a typo a decade ago, without ever setting foot in a store owned by the company that dominates the industry. Whether that pressure genuinely reshapes how most people buy glasses, or whether EssilorLuxottica's retail footprint, brand licensing, and insurance ties end up being sturdy enough to absorb it, is still an open question. It's worth being careful here too, because EssilorLuxottica's stock has actually had a rough stretch through 2026, down significantly from where it started the year, though that decline reflects a mix of broader market pressures and company-specific factors, not something that can be cleanly pinned on direct-to-consumer competition from Chinese manufacturing alone. What's not in question is where the actual manufacturing has been happening this entire time, and how much of the traditional price of a pair of glasses had nothing to do with the cost of making them at all. The eyewear industry spent decades built around the assumption that the enormous gap between a $4 frame and an $800 retail price was simply the cost of doing business, brand, insurance, and retail overhead baked so deeply into the system that most people never thought to question it. Companies willing to sell straight from the same factories, skipping every layer in between, are the first real test of whether that assumption was ever actually necessary. That's it for today. Hope this one gave you a different way of looking at something as ordinary as a pair of glasses. Let me know in the comments if you've ever actually priced out where your own glasses were made, and I'll see you in the next one.